You have to give your name?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
This is Gregory Simmons, and today on April 17th, 2016, I have the privilege of interviewing with Jean Freeman, who will discuss the history of her life.
My name is Jean Freeman. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was born in the old Grady Hospital downtown. My mother was born in South Carolina, and that's where her family comes from. But my father's side was born in Atlanta. My mother was I guess you would call it, a maid, and my father worked at a factory. The religion background, they were both Baptists, and it was observed in our home. I don't recall much about their political parties that they belonged in, but I took on in the 60s, I think in the early 60s, of being a Democrat because that was the time that the civil rights movement was going on. I lived some of my lifetime, my early lifetime, in Chicago, but when I came back in the late 50s, early 60s, was when a lot of things I noticed was different than living in Chicago. I remember in the 60s when the civil rights was going on, they were talking to us about the political views of the community or the city at church more so. I wasn't attending meetings. That's where my mother always took us.
So majority of anything to do with the civil rights movement was at church.
Yes, that was when you start realizing what was going on. Because when I lived in Chicago, I don't remember the segregation. We went wherever we wanted to go or whatever like that. Mm-hmm. But I remember when I came back to Atlanta, sitting at the back of the bus, the colored lunch counters and things downtown. I remember Rich's was a large department store, but the whites ate up on the upper floor and the blacks ate at cafeteria, restaurant part was in the basement.
So it was a bit of a culture shock coming from Chicago back to
Atlanta. It sure was. But I always liked Atlanta. I always liked it. I think the most negative thing of coming back here, I had never been called a name, and I was standing downtown waiting on the bus, and some white boys came down the street in a car and hollered out and called me a black nigger. And I never had experienced that before. And I can imagine how people felt then, because I felt like somebody had hit me or shot me, and I was by myself. But I remember an older lady came over to me and hugged me because I started crying. And she told me, she said, "They just stupid. Don't worry about it." She said, "You'll be okay." So that was something that told me that we did reach out to comfort the younger people, because I was standing there, might have been waiting on my mother to meet her at the bus stop, but that was really a culture shock for me.
Okay. So your mom was still she was still a maid in Atlanta?
Yes.
And
yes.
How was that, her life being a maid?
I remember her going to work early in the morning before we went to school, and she didn't come home until 7 because she went every day and cleaned the couple home, but she stayed and fixed their dinner and had to clean up the kitchen before she could come home.
Mm-hmm. And that's what she did all throughout life. She didn't.
She did that until she was in her 50s. In some kind of way, she got a job. She was still a housekeeper at Westminster School. Mm-hmm. And that was an eye-opener because that was a bigger income. She was the housekeeper for the head master out there, I guess, or something. I don't remember, because I was married, and I always just remember sometimes having to go and pick her up or whatever like that.
What about your father?
My father and mother were not together at that time, so my father still lived in Chicago, and he worked. It was just totally different, the lifestyle. But I left my father to come back to be with my mother, and he never wanted me to come back because he knew he left here because of the harshness and not able to get a good job or whatever like that.
And he stayed in the factories up until
Yes.
to later on in life.
He retired. But I think he worked in maintenance or something. He didn't do a whole lot of talking about his job. If you think back, they talked about more of the outside than they did about what was going on in the community more so than their jobs.
So you feel like down in the South in Atlanta was stronger communities than in Chicago?
Well, I had more family here in the South than I did because in Chicago it was just me, my dad, and my stepmother, and a cousin came to live with us who was younger than me. And that was when my grandmother passed. It was two cousins. My dad took one of the boys, and my uncle in Michigan took the other boy. And that's what she told them before she passed. And they more or less took them from their mother. And I don't know that she have a voice in whatever the grandmother said. That was the best for them. And then the aunts, I guess later on in years, they came to Michigan. One stayed in Chicago a little while, but they never liked that big city. In Saginaw, Michigan, it was a small community.
How was it raising mom and everything down here during the peak of civil rights? Because mom was born in 69?
63.
63?
Deborah was born the first child was in 1960. The second child was in 63. And when she was about 7 or 8, they integrated Ford company here, Ford assembly plant. And Henry, my husband, went to work there, and he was one of the few blacks that were able to go in there. And that was during the civil rights. They had to allow them in there. I forgot what they called it. But the only blacks that worked in the Ford plant, to my understanding, was the maintenance people. And he went in working on the assembly line.
Okay. And then what did you do as far as
I was always at home mom. I always stayed at home. He never wanted me to work. I always wanted to work, but I was always an at home mom taking care of kids. I worked like in a envelope factory for 5 or 6 years, and never was really. It wasn't a big thing because I would always be the one. He said that if the kids got sick, stay at home. If anything came up, and I think it was good because during that time when my father got sick in Chicago, I would go up there and stay with him some while he was sick. And Henry was always able to hold the house down until I came back. So it wasn't like he needed my income to keep the house going. He made enough at the Ford plant to take care of us.
Okay. So I did like the boycotts and everything affect
the one that stands out with me more is when some of the kids that left high school went away to college, like over at the AU Center. I remember them leaving classes and going downtown protesting. I remember some of them got locked up, and I remember seeing on the news how they had the inmates in the city jail drag the girls by their legs across the floor because they wouldn't get up. They were sitting down. And everybody thought that was real bad for them to get the black inmates there to drag the girls across the floor when they were locking them up. But I remember when the community people, they would come out and talk to you, and they would say, we're going to boycott certain stores. And we observed what they said. We didn't go and shop in Riches. And I think it was a bleak time because the stores depend on us, the blacks, for the holidays because we really go overboard spending for our kids. And I remember that Christmas, nobody went into the stores. It might have seemed a little harder, but we observed it. That we just stopped shopping at a lot of stores, and things did get better.
And what year was this?
This was in the 60s. I can't remember. Yeah, it was in the 60s. I remember going to Ebenezer and seeing Martin Luther King preach some Sundays along with his dad. But I remember, and he was a short man. From hearing him on the radio and whatever like that, you would think he was a big man. Yeah. But he was a short man. And he always, to me, my father looked like him. I'll show a picture of where my dad kind of reminds me of him. But I remember Martin Luther King's father was more outspoken to me than Martin Jr. was, because he was a Baptist minister, and he came to the different churches and whatever like that and would telling you don't shop this place or whatever like that. But I remember in the 60s, they used to have, they call it a black slate, and they would have all of the candidates on there where they wanted you to vote. So you always remember those people's names, and that's the way you voted. That used to supported them. I remember when Maynard Jackson came to the church that I was attending, which was Israel Baptist Church. I would never forget him. He was a big, light-skinned man with blue eyes, and he was running against Herman Talmadge, who had been a senator from Georgia for years, and nobody ran against him. And I remember him telling about his family and all of that, but I remember him running, and he didn't win, but he didn't give up. And the next time he ran for the mayor, I think, of Atlanta, he did win. But I remember him. I remember Leroy Johnson, I believe, who had been an elected official, and looked like he had to go to court to get his seat because they would not acknowledge him. So those are people that were locally in the 60s. I really took interest in the politics. Where to shop, where not to shop. I remember when my husband and I was dating on Sunday, we would go to the movie, and we always went to most of the time, not the neighborhood theater. We would go downtown to the Fox Theater, and you bought your ticket on the outside, if I'm not mistaken, but you had to walk on the outside up so many steps, and you sat in the balcony. We were not allowed to sit on the lower level. I do remember that. And then they had the refreshment machines up there on that level too, Henry. Yeah. But you only had the balcony up there. And I remember that because I remember when I had my first child, and that was in the 60s. And I remember going up there, and I didn't take her with me, but I remember still having to go up those steps. And I never did that when I lived in Chicago. We went in the same door. Yeah. That was a difference in it. And I think sometimes when people say they don't want to vote, it really bothers me that it's not just the president that you vote for, but also you're concerned about your community. I remember when they had the civil rights hearings on TV, and I remember one person stuck out more to me than anybody else, who was Fannie Lou Hamer out of Mississippi. And she talked about, for generations, her family was raised on this plantation, and she only had a 3rd or 4th grade reading level, and the people came down and was encouraging them to register to vote. And the man that was over the plantation told her if she went and registered to vote, now it wasn't vote, registered to vote, she could no longer live on the plantation. And that was the only thing she had ever known. So her and her husband both, and they had quite a few children, but she still went and did it. And she talked about how they beat her when she went down there and put the dogs on her, but she did have an opportunity to register to vote. But
there was a lot of deterrence for her voting.
Yes, yeah. With a third, it was a third or fourth grade education.
They had literacy tests, didn't they?
Yes,
she registered as well.
Yes. And I remember when I registered, we just went, I think, in the gym or something other, and just registered. The people were there. It was no problem. But there, people were still living on plantation, and so that's why even I guess until I die, I will always encourage young, especially the black males, be a voter, be a community person, talk to the younger ones, encourage them to go back to school. If you can't afford a 4-year college school, go to a 2-year, find a trade school, but do something, but just don't sit down and be a waste. And I hope that before I leave this earth, that I will write a book just about my life experience, because I heard a minister one time. His name was Miles Monroe, and I was hearing him speak. He said too many blacks were dying and taking their books to the grave, and I don't want to do that. You leave a legacy or something, and if it's not about anything, just your life experience.
Yeah.
And after I got married, and my dad still lived in Chicago, I would spend one holiday with my mom, which I was here, which would be Thanksgiving and Christmas. But I always, when I started having children, made sure the children knew their grandfather. And we would drive or fly or whatever. We went just about every year to Chicago so the children would know who their grandfather and their grandmother was. I loved my stepmother, but I knew the difference in a stepmother and my mother. But she showed no difference with me. And one thing I would always feel, and I guess I got the positive part of about family, they never brought up their past to me, or my mother tried to turn me against my father. And when my dad and my stepmother would come down and would stay with me, I would have all of them over here to the house, and they would laugh because they grew up in the same community. Yeah. So I think it was in let me see, I think in the 90s. In 1960, my mother took me to her family reunion in South Carolina. And from then on in 1960, I started going back and attending the reunion every year. And I think in the 80s, they called different ones up and asked, would we be chapter representative? And the way they were picking them, the ones that would come all the time, and knew other family members that lived in their city. And so they formed, I think it was 7 or 8, or might have been 9 chapters. It was Georgia, 2 chapters in South Carolina, 2 chapters in North Carolina, Detroit, Washington, and D.C. And so we would meet once a year. Whenever we would come to the reunion, we were saying what we wanted to do and how to make the reunion grow. And we formed a board. We came together. We wrote bylaws. We designed a family crest. And it was one of the cousins who was in the chapter in Washington, D.C. His name was R.C. And we had the same last name, Freeman, but we were not related. He said, I want us to create our own crest and not pull one out of the book that represent and spoke about our family. And we would laugh at him, I guess, maybe 5 years. And then one year he said, let's meet after the reunion. And we met in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at a cousin house. And we sat down. He came up with the symbols, and one of the cousins, who was an artist, drew the crest. And we put the meaning of what we got together. We decided what each symbol meant. And then I was elected president, I think, about twice. And the reunion just grew. So I still attend the reunion. And the part that bothers me more so, the older ones, my age, which is 70 or older, we're dying, and the ones that coming behind us don't seem to think that it's important for the family reunion and the history. I was elected as one of the historian, and when they had the 40th reunion, I remember getting the program, and it said, the root of our family, which is on my mother's side, the matriarch side, was Ed Sloan and Clara, and they were slaves, and that's all they knew. And I just started thinking, that has to be something more to the family than that. And I think by that time, my mother was deceased. So I started asking her brothers, and we just started trying to figure it out. So I came home in the 90s one time, and I said, I've got to find out how to find out more about the history. And I met someone at the library and said they were a part of a genealogy group, and they met there in East Point every third Sunday. And I went and joined that group. And they gave you points about going to the archives, and they would help you, teach you how to look up your history. And I started going to the archives, which was in East Point then. And looking at those reels and understanding that they told me, well, what county, what state were your family from, what county? And then I knew some names, and I started looking up and finding, and you would go to the census, and I started finding family names, and I just started going back more and more until, did it match what I had been told, the hearsay? I knew more about my mother's side than I did by my dad's side. I only knew my dad's mother. She was the only, my dad's mother was the only grandparents that I met. I remember her clearly because I remember when I would come down from Chicago, I got a chance to stay with her, and I would sleep with her, and I remember she sewed. And I stayed one weekend with her, and she made me 2 skirts by hand. And she didn't have a sewing machine or anything, and I remember her taking a string and putting it around my waist to get my waist measurement, and she sat there and sewed. I knew nothing about sewing, that hadn't come up. But I learned years later that sewing is easy for me. And then when I went back at one of the reunion, I wanted to find out more about these names. I'm switching about a little bit because I know more on my mother's side. I've kept hearing these names, and I started looking these names up in the census. I couldn't find the women, but I could find the men's, because women get married and names change, but the men's names stay the same. So one of the chapter members brought and gave us all an 1870 CD. And they gave, it was no last names on there. You just had first names, and then they would ask, I think they had on that CD, but where they were born or whatever like that. So then I went back and I started just getting close to people and talking to them more in private than outward. Because when you talk to them out in the out and say, where were you born or whatever like that, and they would say, well, I don't remember. I don't remember. So I started getting them in a little small, intimate huddle, and they would tell me a little bit.
Tell you more.
Yeah, they would tell you. Yes. You can't put a microphone or a tape recorder in their face.
Yeah.
You got to sit it somewhere and hide it and just talk, or either try to remember. But I remember deciding I wanted to make a quilt. And somebody in the group told me they were teaching a quilt class at the Southwest Art Center. But I started asking people for pictures, and nobody had pictures, they were telling me. So I went back and I sent a letter out, or either I told them at the reunion, I said, I want to do a military quilt. I said, all of the Sloan descendant men, if they served in the military, send me a picture of them in their uniform, and I'm going to put it on a quilt, and I'll have it at the reunion the next time. So I got boohoo's of pictures. And then I saw These were little old men I had seen at the reunion, or some younger ones in my age I never knew served in the military. Well, then when I thought back, my dad served in the military, his brother served in the military, and my two cousins served in the military. But each one of them served a different branch in the military, and I never thought about that.
Mm.
So,
What branch did your dad serve?
My dad served in the Navy. That's his picture on the shelf up there.
Okay.
Yeah, he served. His brother, the Army, and one cousin was Air Force, and the other was Marine.
Was he in any wars?
My dad and his brother was served in the 1940s, so that would have been World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then.
Did he ever talk about World War II?
My dad never talked about the military, and both of them was gone before I got into genealogy.
Mm-hmm.
My cousin Curtis, that lives in Michigan, I think he served, but I just told him I want to do a history for the National Museum, in D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
and they do a 15-minute video, and they said yes, but I never got a chance to do all of that. So there's still an opportunity that you could talk to him and do. And his son served in the military. But a lot of family members I didn't know, so little by little I do know some that are still living. I have a cousin that lives in Virginia. He served. He did 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I have a female cousin, and I didn't know the females in the family. I only knew the one cousin lived here. She served in there, and she's in her 70s. But I found two females on the Sloan side served. It was a mother served in the Army, and the daughter served in the Coast Guard.
Mm-hmm.
And they both are still living. All three of the females are still living. But what I found out, and when I put the pictures on the quilt, and we showed it at the reunion. I show it every year. I take the quilt and show it. They are so proud. And then I had cousins sending their son's picture. But I took it from being a military quilt and did it as a community quilt. So I have two cousins that was a police officer, and another was a military police officer. And I think one of them had moved up to a detective. So I opened it up for all.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the Sloan side, after I found out the children's of Ed and Clara Sloan, I did a quilt for each one of them. So I think I end up with either 3 quilts or 4 quilts.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where I saw the repeating of names, like Clara. And when we were at the reunion and we asked who was Ed Sloan's wife, and nobody could remember, and I came back home and asked my brother, and he said, oh, her name was Clara. Mm-hmm. Well, my grandmother's name was Clara.
Yeah.
And then my brother had a daughter. Her name was Clara. Then my mother's sister had a daughter named Clara. So they was named after their great-grandmother. And I don't guess we ever realized it. And if I'm not mistaken, each one of Ed's children had a Clara in their family. Mm-hmm. That was one. But I never did see a Ed. I haven't ran across another Ed. Ed Sr., the great-grandfather, was the only one. But the Claras, I did find them. And let me see. Oh, I can't think of anything. But we still do the reunion. Mm-hmm. We still do that. We still do our crest. I had a banner made with our family crest on, and it is carried into the reunion every year. We have T-shirts every year. We have T-shirts with our crest on it, and we always wear it to our cookout. And a lot of the younger ones want to change it, and we said, no, you can't change the crest. That's our. Mm-hmm. We design it, so, but they don't get it. They want to change the colors. We have family colors, and we tell them what the colors and symbols represent, but some still will say, well, that's old-fashioned. We need to change. But if you go to a lot of old families, that have their crest, they never change it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was bragging about I think it was 3,000 family members on my tree, and and I was in the store and I was talking to it might have been Staples or Office Depot, and I was buying the family trees. I had purchased family tree software, and I was talking with the salesman. I said, "Oh, I have this thing, so many family members on my tree," and he told me that he came from Stockholm and they had 4 volumes of their family tree. And he told me the aunt was the one that had all of the books. And I said, well, my God, I can only go back to 1880 with my family. And then I said, what if we could go back further than that? So I went to D.C. to the conference one year, the African American Genealogy History Society. I went to that conference one year in D.C. And Rick Skittle was there, and he came and talked about the DNA in his workshop. And I always wanted to know about that. So Hillside Truth Center had a workshop in the I forgot her name, Gina, who works with Rick Skittle of the African American Genealogy Society, was there, and I went and did my DNA.
Yeah, then.
Yes, so I have the paperwork on that, and I try to encourage everybody to do that. I can only go back on the matriarch side, being the female. It takes a male to do the patriarch side, and a male can do both sides of the family too. So I say sometimes, one friend of mine's what they did. She did the matriarch side, and her and the nephew put that dollars together and did her brother, because he had no interest in it. I never felt negative about Africa. I had an opportunity to go there twice. As a little girl, and I can remember back when I was like 7 or 8 and Tarzan movie was out, I always wanted to go to Africa. And one thing that always puzzled me, how could a man who was white that was left in Africa, he knew everything more about Africa, and he was the king, and the ones that was born there who was African, he could overpower them, and he was just smarter, and I just knew that was lopsided at history.
Even at an early age.
At an early age, I always knew it's some. When I had an opportunity to go to Africa, I went to Ghana and I went to Zimbabwe. I totally enjoyed my trips. I lived in the homes with African families. I went to church with them. They know their history. That was one thing. Ghana was the most eye-opening part of the trip, because that was our leisure time. We got a chance to go to the museum. We went to W.D. Du Bois' home. We went to his graveside, which is on his home ground. They have taken his home and made it like a museum, so you go in it. They know their history.
Yeah, I just finished that book you gave me.
Oh, yeah.
W.D. Du Bois' book.
I got it there. I got a little souvenir. I really enjoyed it. That's one family trip I wish we would do. Just fly into one of those areas. But Ghana would be one that I would like to go to. But when I did the DNA, my DNA was found in Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. But what you can do on the African Ancestry website, you can connect with other people that have the same DNA with you. I haven't did that. I kind of went on there a couple of times and see what they were writing about. But one of the genealogy group, I can't remember where he found his DNA, but he went there. It was by being connected with the group in D.C., he formed other people, and they got a trip up and went to Africa. And when he went, he said they treated him like he was a little king. And one of the ladies, she's a librarian in Virginia, she took her 16-year-old son, and she said that she was having some discipline problems with him, and her husband agreed to take him with them over there. But she said that the men in that village took him aside and initiated him and talked to him. And she said when he came back, I hadn't talked to her in a couple of years, he came back a different person. From them talking to him. And I think it's to the part that when you look at TV or read or hear people say things nowadays, you're made to feel or try to be made to feel less than who you really are. And when you go there, I remember this man said, we don't name our children after anybody. We name them after people of good conduct. He said, because that's a name that they have to carry. And he talked about how many days after a child is born, the father names the child, but the child has part of the father name. It's a reason that child has that name, and they know the meaning of their name. The family that I stayed with in Zimbabwe, and I stayed with them a week, they had 2 boys and 1 girl. And by apartheid ending, they had a nice home. They had a swimming pool in their yard. But I noticed that all of the homes had high walls around them. So you had to get out and either had to remote to open the gate, or you had to get out and unlock the gate to get inside. So like each home was like a compound. So I did know that. But one thing that I remember of this family, on the last day that I was going to be with, the last night that I stayed with them, because we were leaving out to come home the next day, they serenaded me with song. And the whole family, the kids was so manable, the family. But the father told me, the mother worked at the bank, and the father owned his computer shop. And he would